Managing Violence Podcast, Season 5, Episode 2, with Dr. Richard Diston. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again to another episode of the Managing Violence Podcast. I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode and to all our other shows. Look, we know podcast listenership is down globally at the moment. People aren't commuting as much. They're not spending as much time on trains and buses and trams and subways. They're not spending as much time in their cars, which means, podcasters are taking a bit of a hit. But if you've gone out of your way to listen to this content, it really means the world to us that you appreciate the work that goes into making these shows happen and the guests taking their time to provide that content. So thank you very much for all of you that have stayed loyal and continue to listen to the show. Please keep spreading the word. This is the time we want to get new listeners on board so that when everyone goes back to normal life, we can spread the word even further. All right, my guest for today is the first of a number of doctors or PhDs that we've got coming up on this season, and it is Dr. Richard Diston from the UK. Now, Dr. Diston did his PhD research into workplace and organisational violence, and I actually cited his research in a recent research report that I did on the same subject here in Australia. So it was a great pleasure to sit down and talk with Rich. He's a very engaging guy. He's got a lot of practical background from the military and the security world, as well as obviously the academic pedigree of having gone back and done his master's and then his PhD in this field. So it's an interesting chat. Rich is not shy about hurting people's feelings. So if you're a little bit sensitive, especially when it comes to the role of physicality in managing organizational or workplace violence, you may want to resolve yourself to not taking this to heart, or maybe you need to take it to heart if you're too offended by it. Anyway, without further ado, here is Dr. Richard Diston. Dr. Richard Diston, thank you very much for joining us on the Managing Violence Podcast. It's good to hook up again.
It certainly is. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so you were on the Presilience podcast with us a little while ago, which is the sister podcast of this show, and we're talking about things related to security risk management. But today we'd like to really dive into an area that you and I have in common, or an interest that you and I have in common, which is occupational violence. But for the sake of introduction, tell us a little bit about your story, who you are and how you got started.
Yeah, sure. It's always funny when, I say that, I've done a lot in violence. People always kind of give me a funny look on that. Where to begin? I've had a strange relationship with violence, and I've experienced it in a lot of different ways. From a bullying environment at school where I was both, I will admit, I was both a bully and the bullied, which is often the case, I suppose. Yeah. I left school, I joined the military. Violence within the military was currency, it was a pastime, it was the job in some cases, depending on where I was and who I was with. After leaving the military, I went into frontline security, got involved in that, and violence is a heavy thing of that. I'd realised that I wasn't particularly good at it while I was in the military, so
Just to pause there, so in the military, the violence you're talking about is more sort of social or hazing or things like that, or are we talking sort of
the whole spectrum?
Yeah.
There were initiations when people came onto squadrons. There was violence as social currency. There was violence. You'd go out if you weren't fighting each other in the crew room because you were bored. 12 hours sitting around with a bunch of young guys with nothing to do, you're going to start kicking each other in the nuts at some point. After that, there's violence, fighting the locals in the local pubs and the clubs. There was,
sure.
After leaving the military and structural violence as well, which is common in the military, which we'll talk about in a bit.
So we're talking about all sorts of violence that had nothing to do with an actual enemy.
Yeah, in many cases, yes. Yeah, the enemy was ourselves, and
Mm.
the way we kind of interacted and related to each other. Although I wasn't anywhere near as nuanced a thinker as I am now, and so I didn't really recognise it for what it was, what I was seeing and experiencing. It's only years later when I kind of reflect on this stuff. I worked on the doors when I came out. I worked private security. I did nightclubs, I did events, a lot of violence in that. Realising that I wasn't very good at it, I got involved in martial arts. So it's a typical thing. I quite like having my head where it is on my neck. So
Mhm.
I made a point of learning how to do that, and I became, I would argue, competent. Let's say there are many better, there are some worse. So that I'm still standing. So I suppose you could put that out there.
Mhm.
And then because I was teaching martial arts for a living for a period, people would come to me and say, "Hey, you've got a security background. You teach all this martial arts stuff. Can you teach the formal security qualifications that became kind of required in the UK?" And I said, "Well, yeah, probably." I was
Yeah.
teaching doorman, I was teaching bodyguards, I was teaching a variety of people, and so I said, "Yeah." So I got qualified to actually teach formally, um, and then people would ask me, you teach, can you do this, can you do that? And so I began to consult on a wide range of areas, started with the violence stuff and moved into other security risk areas, um, and it just kind of just layer upon layer of experience to the point where when I did my master's, I wanted it to be easy, and because I'd done a lot of reading around the subject anyway, I read voraciously on things that interest me. My master's was on whether the SIA, which is the Security Industry Authority in the UK, who license security practitioners, or certain types of security practitioners rather, they created a formal framework for how to do the physical intervention training.
Yes.
And I looked at it and I didn't think it was very good at the time. So, but rather than just look at it and say, I think that's shit, I actually wanted to do a research piece on it and say, why do I think it's shit? Does this answer the problems that people like me have faced, or does it create additional risk?
That would have been a point of
And
the research project.
well, it was, yeah, it was a tough one. And ultimately, the output of that particular research was that it did increase risk. Um, Training is fundamentally fucked anyway, um, and it's the illusion of managing the problem. And then when I went on to do my professional doctorate in security risk management, I thought, well, I don't really want to be the violence guy. I think I have a little bit more to offer than that. But at
Mhm.
the same time, I still felt that there was a question that needed to be asked, which was, if my previous research has discovered that training for violence is bullshit, what do we got to do?
Well, that's an
What's
excellent question, isn't it?
what's next? Because if training people is both ineffective and potentially unethical, which I'll get into later, challenge me on it. What else should an organization be doing? So I started to look at it as an organizational risk. And I'd read the research and I looked around and I thought, well, hold on a minute. We've had this problem for going on. It's been recognized as a problem since the 70s when
Yeah.
postal workers were taking firearms into work.
Going
And,
postal.
and here we are, whole clean, rending our clothes and pulling our hair and saying, "Oh, it's a terrible problem." So hold on a minute, we haven't even defined what the problem is yet, and all the research out there is looking at this problem from the perspective of either the perpetrator or the victim. Nobody is looking at it from the perspective of the organization, and they're the people who we need to talk to about this stuff, because otherwise they're not going to care. We've got to put
Mhm.
this in formal strategic risk, um, into that paradigm. We need to
Yeah.
be talking about this differently than the effect of violence on nurses or on shop workers or whoever, because nobody cares. Let's be
Mhm.
brutally
They're
honest.
replaceable.
Yeah, the unions care, the victims' families care, but the organisation, they could give a shit.
Yeah.
So we need to be talking about this differently, and that was the basis of my doctoral research, and which kind of led me into your orbit, thankfully.
Yeah, yeah. So let's have a chat about that research. So talk us through the I guess the structure of it, what sort of questions you're looking to ask, and what the processes were you went through to get there.
Well, I started with a literature review where I read damn near everything that's ever been written about workplace violence that's worth reading.
Yeah, I was disappointed I missed out on those textbooks when you're getting rid of them.
Yeah, I think I've still got a few, so yeah, we can hook up and sort it out.
Postage is a bit of a killer, though, mate.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure it would be. Yeah. I read everything, and I was seeing from a very, very high level. I was seeing flaws in the literature. I was seeing flaws in the thinking. I was seeing the fact that people don't believe this when I tell them. There isn't an agreed, unified definition of workplace violence.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There isn't one, and it's a case of you've got. I think it was the ILO. I may stand corrected, but I think it was the International Labour Office. They've tried twice to come to an agreement and a consensus on what the definition of workplace violence should be. And there's pressure from the employers, there's pressure from the unions, there's pressure from academics. All these people have got, and they can't come to an agreement. So we get what we have in legislation now, which is wishy-washy at best. So part of the problem is subjectivity. So I looked at all this, and then I looked at how the research was being conducted. They were asking people who've been involved in violence from either end, mostly talking to victims about how they perceive it. And I can tell you, as having been on both sides of these kind of equations, my perceptions of a violent incident while I'm in it and 3, 6, 9 months later vary dramatically.
Absolutely.
Up to the point where there are some situations that I felt quite sore about at the time, and then a couple of weeks later I thought, you know what, I totally deserved that. So I suppose that's a part of maturing as a human being. But
there's some you look back on and you go, man, I wonder what lessons I would have missed out on had I not been involved in that.
Absolutely. This is I think some of the a phrase that I picked up from one of my old mentors was, a good beating never hurt anyone.
You got to struggle to get that onto the organisational risk register, though.
Absolutely, it's a positive thing.
Yes, our interns need the occasional beating.
But I have to say, and many of my mentors will kind of probably back me up, that there are occasions violence isn't the answer until it's the only answer.
Yeah, that's right.
And there were some cases where I have needed a slap to wake me up, but I'm not promoting violence as a teaching tool, for the record, just for the audience out there.
Well, sometimes you miss all the other cues first.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wider conversation about the social contract and social discipline, but we're not doing that at the moment. So the research, I also realized that they were asking the wrong people, and that there is a body of expertise and I'm going to offend a number of your listeners here. There's a body of expertise who are basically fucking idiots. They are. and I say this with comfort because I used to be one of them. I was described as a hammer looking for nails.
Yeah.
I was a dumbass martial artist who thought that I had the answers to all the problems just by laying my hands on people and kind of doing it in a certain magical way. And the more I read and the more I understood about the nature of the problem, the more I realized that people like me were part of the problem.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Actually, I've said it a few times recently on a couple of different gigs that while when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's amazing how many screws and bolts you can also bang in if you hit them hard enough. And,
exactly. Yeah, and it
get away with it for a little while.
And it takes a degree of honesty to look back and say, you know what, I was just a hooligan. And I might know some big words, and I was ultimately part of the problem. And so when I started interviewing, looking for, okay, who can I talk to about this problem? If I'm looking at this from an organizational risk perspective, who should I be talking to? And it was very, very difficult finding people who could have an intelligent adult conversation about this without starting to talk about their system of physical intervention bullshit. And I would. There were a bunch of people that I interviewed who I had to stop the interview and thank them for their time because they didn't even understand some of the terminology that was being used regarding risk management. So I thought, if the only thing you can offer is physical intervention training, and the vast majority of, I'm wagging my fingers in the air here, experts are either martial artists, ex-police officers, or kind of hooligan I worked on the doors for a number of years, and so I'm an expert, blah blah blah. And those guys can fuck right off because they offer nothing to a solution.
Mm, mm.
Um,
They're kind of they've got pointy end solutions, which is helpful if you find yourself at the pointy end. But when it comes to actually eliminating the problem or trying to prevent the problem from occurring in the first place, not quite as
and,
useful.
and absolutely, and it might well be. And I've kind of asked myself, I've challenged myself continuously on this as well. Because there have been situations where I've done a range of martial arts, and I've done a number of different things, and I found myself in situations where I handled it like a god, and I've had other situations where I fucked it right up and I fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't say whether that was it was me, but was that the training? Is that the system? And if that's me with years of expertise of being grabbed and grabbing and doing all the other stuff, I've got an hour with somebody in an in an office. How am I going to give them the ability to handle someone who's coming at them with the intent of ripping off their head when I can't guarantee that I will handle it well? It's there is an arrogance and an illusion, and I did I spent a while studying Russian Sistema, which it ruined me as a martial artist, I got to tell you, because I realized how much bullshit all of it is. And the idea that, I mean, let's be realistic about it. Let's look at any martial arts system. How many people get into significant threat hand-to-hand combat encounters and survive them long enough to develop a system?
Yeah, there's not a lot.
So what we're actually looking at is someone's idea of what they think it is. They might have had a couple of rows back in the day, and then they've developed a couple of methods and a couple of things work for them. But you know what? A 2x4 over the back of the head when they're not looking is usually the thing that's going to win it.
Yeah, I always have these question marks about people that are knife fighting experts, and there are people like that.
I've met these guys.
But I mean, the honest ones will tell you, no, look, they may have had one or two knife situations in their life, but it's not enough to draw expertise from. It's passed on lessons from generations.
A lot of it is luck. The more I studied what I'd done and the encounters, I would sit back and generally, kind of do the adrenal climb down, kind of blowing my lips off my teeth and say, man, I was lucky there.
Yeah, well, look, I dealt with a knife 3 times. One time I got stabbed. I didn't even know there was a knife involved. And the other 2 times I managed to get to it as he was drawing it out of his waistband. And that was it. And purely it was luck. I had no idea I was dealing with a knife any one of those 3 occasions until, the 2 times he was drawing it out of his waistband. I acted because I recognized that movement wasn't. Yeah, there's no excuse for scratching your ass while you're yelling at me. So I knew that movement wasn't good. And the 3rd time it was just a somewhat peaceful eviction out of a nightclub, and the guy ended up stabbing me in the leg with a pocket knife, and I didn't even realize until he was a block away that I'd been stabbed. But anyway, that's a different story. But
we would stand up with our expertise in front of a room full of people and claim that we're the expert on this subject and we should be listened to.
Well, that's right.
So coming across, so I weeded all of these guys out, and then I started speaking to people who work in sectors that are demonstrably affected by workplace violence, and people who may have the responsibility for dealing with it within their organizations. And then I started asking not about their personal experiences of what they've done and where they did it, but their organizational experiences of how these things are responded to, how they are perceived, how they're assessed. And it was eye-opening. And I was very, very careful not to project my own opinions onto these people. I was curious about what they had experienced, because it wasn't about what I thought it was. I was curious about whether my experience organizationally is reflected in, and it doesn't matter whether or not we're talking about education or NGOs or any of the other sectors that I was dealing with. It was across the board, there were certain themes. And then when I look back at I kind of triangulated the research with the literature, and I realized that all the things that these people were saying has been said for 20 odd years in the literature. But the thing is, it's not being looked at from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those findings. What was it that surprised you?
Well, I was surprised at how some of the literature, certainly some of the older literature, nailed it 20 years ago when they started talking about the biggest problems that. I mean, let's look at the typologies of violence. I started talking to these so-called experts about the typologies of violence, and they wouldn't know that one existed. And you've got the CDC typology, you've got the occupational health, the California one, and these things for practical risk management usage are fundamentally useless. Knowing that my staff are going to be assaulted by someone who is either an insider, an outsider, a customer, whatever, that doesn't help me stop it. You just, oh, great, so you got stabbed by this guy, fantastic. It doesn't help you understand. And following on from that thread of kind of conversation around, okay, if this is the problem, what do we got to do about it? If our only solution to the problem of violence is teaching our staff how to fight, we are ethically and morally bankrupt.
Yep.
We should not be putting them in a position where they should have to throw down every day as a part of their job.
No, well, we're already at the second lowest level of control at that point.
I mean, exactly. Yeah. And when you see, one of the outcomes I created, part of the research, I created my own typology of violence, which I called the WRV8. Which were the 8 primary if violence is going to happen between individuals, because there is a 9th type, but violence is going to happen between individuals. Why? What is the prime motivator? Now, I know that violence is a complex thing and there is usually more than one reason for it, but what's the intent? Why is somebody doing this? Because that then gives us an idea to say, well, okay, let me explain it this way. Fire's the same everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hot, yellow, bit wobbly. Great.
I it's yellow. If it's blue or white, it's the problem.
Well, right. Now, it's depending on what's burning,
Yes.
depends on what your response should be.
Mm.
Now, if you grab the wrong extinguisher, if you respond to what appears to be a similar fire in the wrong way, you're going to make things much, much worse.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we are using the same extinguisher on every type of violence.
And unfortunately, most of the times the extinguisher is empty because we gave them half an hour of training.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a bucket of sand they can go and crap in. This is exactly part of the primary problem, is that we need to start thinking about how these things happen. And then the 9th of the 8 types, the 9th type is structural violence. And if an organization violence is not a problem for organizations as much as it's a problem of organization.
Mm. So just define structural violence for us.
Yeah, sure. It's the ways in which the organization conducts itself, the things that the organization allowed to be continued in its name. Now, whether this is sexist hiring practices, whether this is, the lack of PPE, if you're putting your staff in harm's way, but you're not giving them the adequate protection. If risk assessment, we'll talk about risk assessment shortly. If risk assessment isn't being conducted, if they're not being trained, if we're just turning a blind eye and saying, oh, well, fuck it, they get $10 an hour.
Yep.
That is organizational violence. Whether it's perpetrated by the board through a lack of governance, and violence is a governance issue, or whether it's bullying managers and incompetent managers, or whether it is mobbing and bullying at the shop floor level, these things aren't being addressed, then that is structural violence. Kind of makes me sound like a snowflake, and I'm really not.
I think I picked up earlier that you're not, but I think it's completely valid though. I mean, you and I both worked in organisations where there was a strong culture of just a complete disregard for the welfare of their personnel, or any ethical obligation regarding the way they conduct business, and that seemed to be. I mean, look, I'm just talking about the private security industry when I got into it. I mean, there was a handful of good companies, but it was just the way business was done. I mean, if you
Well,
got to complain about your treatment, then you just didn't get any hours next week.
exactly, and that we've seen it, and I'll give you a slightly different example of structural violence. Is where I was working for an organisation, a staff member left my team, and then they decided that they were going to reallocate budget without discussion with me, so I wasn't going to get that staff member replaced, which meant that it was harder for me to do my job.
Mm.
That is organizational violence, that's structural violence. It was, and it was all, that relationship kind of ended badly ultimately, and it was because that I was being excluded from decision making. I was being, and I was a senior manager, but there were decisions being made that directly affected my ability to do my job. And if we look at violence as a word, we can come back to definition before we move on. One of the things that I struggled with throughout the thesis was this definitional problem. How do we describe it? How do we want to talk about it? And I struck on, when I use the word violence, people automatically, logically and understandably go towards the idea of people hitting each other.
Mm-hmm.
If they're a little bit more kind of well-read or expanded in their thinking, they might also consider, bullying and that kind of stuff in there as well. But I went back to, there was one particular thinker, he went back to the root of the word violence, which is violans, which means to carry force against in Latin.
Mm-hmm.
And it links closely to the root of the word violation. So if you start thinking about the ways in which a person can be violated, and I don't mean the fun ways, you can violate somebody physically, you can violate them emotionally, you can violate them mentally, you can violate them socially in terms of their reputation and kind of their interactions, and kind of sending them to Coventry and not talking to them, all that kind of stuff. You can, violence is described as any deliberate action that constrains somebody's potential. Now that does sound very, very Me Too.
It does. I like the definition though.
But I like it, and the more I read it, and the more I realised that maybe I'm a little bit more woke than I thought, because you look at these situations, and I'm a staunch advocate of freedom. I want freedom for myself. I want freedom from myself. My own limitations, my own perspectives. I want to be free from other people's judgment and other people's opinions, and everybody else should be the same way. No one's entitled to an opinion on how someone else lives their life unless it negatively affects you. And so when I started looking at what this concept of violation means within the workplace, I started then drawing parallels to the Me Too movement and, sexism and harassment tribunals and all this. And I realized that all of this was on the spectrum.
Yeah.
This is all violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. And all of a sudden, it's funny through the course of this podcast, as I've started to expand what I'm looking at, I'm starting to see, this is achieving more than just getting people to stop punching each other.
It has to be
topics,
We are, and I think now is the time for the conversation as well. Particularly when we consider that if I go to an enterprise and I start talking about violence, they are not going to listen.
Yeah.
Because they will do one of two things. They'll either say, yeah, we get a shit ton of that. That's just our job. That's just what we do. Or they say, nah, it never happens here. We don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. So we've never had an incident of violence. It's all good.
Yeah, absolutely. So it either never happens or it happens all the time. And either of those is considered a normal.
Yep.
If I start talking to them about becoming a more productive workplace, if your staff are more engaged, if they are treated respectfully, if they feel safe, not only are you doing your governance, making your governance, meeting your governance requirements and your legal, moral, ethical obligations, but you're going to have a much more productive workplace. You're not going to have to worry about what your staff are doing, and you could probably fire an entire tier of management because your staff don't need management. They need leadership. And if they're getting it and they're being treated like a human being, your problems in terms of the structural and your internal violence dealt with. Then we only have to worry about the stuff that walks in the front door, and we can do that too.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting parallel? You think about it, let's just pause organizations and workplaces for a second and talk about society. That
Mm.
if we had a whole bunch of young people, especially young men, that had better leadership, perhaps we would need a whole lot less custodians.
Well,
That,
well, I think it is interesting you say that. And if we, a lot of the research, and it took me a long time to kind of separate and kind of really hone what I was looking for. I wasn't interested in looking at violence as a sociological construct or a anthropological kind of phenomenon. I wasn't in those are problems that if I'm a consultant and I'm going to a workplace and talking about this stuff, I don't care what kind of upbringing somebody had, because that is way out of my control.
yeah, yeah.
So
Unless
I'm
you're hiring.
not. And that's a whole other area. Um, we can talk about negligent hiring and the fact that most organisations want to hire psychopaths because they're more productive, but well, that's a
Mhm.
separate conversation. It's this, it's this challenge of saying, okay, where does our level of influence and where does our moral and ethical obligation stop? For example, right now we're in lockdown on account of the pandemic situation, and people have been talking, and I've seen a couple of conversations around, well, what happens with domestic violence? Whose responsibility is that as far as an employer is concerned? And my answer is very simple: that has nothing to do with the employer until the staff member goes to the employer and says, I'm having a problem. At which point, then there's I don't know certainly about legal, but certainly there's an ethical and moral obligation to say, all right, let's help you out. And it doesn't matter whether we're in lockdown or whether, because we know that if somebody's in a domestic violence situation and they leave their partner and try and get away, they're going to show up at work
Yes,
because that's where they know they can find them. So
yes.
there needs to be a structured response to that, and lockdown is just another facet of that. But they're going to do a box ticking risk assessment that your
Mm.
living room is safe in terms of violence is
Oh,
madness.
that's right.
We need to be rational about this.
Yeah, can you just shift your work hours so you're working when they're passed out drunk instead of annoying?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's not a simple problem, and that might seem like a pat answer, and there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of layers on what can be done and what should be done. And I think we first need to be clear on what should be done.
Mm.
At what level? Because we can talk about, okay, we want to reduce crime in our convenience store, so we're going to go out into the local neighborhood and talk to the gangs, and we're going to give them a mentoring program. Fuck off. Who do you think you are? Who's paying for all this? It's not going to work. You're going to get capped.
It's gonna be a very long process before those gangs want to talk to you. I'm not
Yeah,
saying
beyond.
shooting down the aspiration. I'm just saying let's be realistic. That this is a generational solution. This is not a 3 months of funding solution.
Absolutely, and it is one of those things that I think, from a societal perspective, I think and I will share I'm not a religious individual. I know people are, and again, it's that freedom from judgment thing. If it gets people through the day and gets them through their lives, great, carry on. Just leave me out of it. But I think stoicism is something, as a philosophy for living, that we should be teaching people younger. That should be a yeah, it's helped me tremendously, because I was one of those young men. I was angry at the world, and I thought I could beat it into submission, and quite the opposite happened. And if I'd had stoicism much earlier, I would have reached the place I am now far faster.
It's interesting that you mentioned stoicism, because I was just talking to you offline about having taken a week off and spending a week unplugged and working away in a workshop. And while I was working, I was listening to Ryan Holiday,
Mm,
and stillness is the key. And then I started listening to some Seneca, and so yeah, it's a good time
yeah,
to talk about
it,
stoicism.
it's incredible when you look at the way people respond to and handle their problems. And this is really what we're talking about. People losing their shit in a shop because they can't get a refund. People losing their shit in the workplace because somebody misspoke to them. Stoicism has an answer for all of this.
Mm.
And that's what is within my control, what is not within my control. And if somebody offends me and if somebody talks about me negatively, you know what? I can't control what they said. I can control my response.
Exactly. And
And if
sorry, yeah, you just brought up a conversation I heard several years ago. I have a feeling it may have even been on the Jocko podcast with Jocko Willink.
mm,
He was saying that he thinks that I think they were talking about shootings, police shootings in the US, and that there should be a class in high schools about how to interact with police so that you don't get shot. And
yeah,
you know what? As much as it's like, oh, that's victim blaming, and they should just not be shooting people of color, and so on and so forth. It was his point was, let's control the things we can control, which is if I am a loudmouth, or I argue, or I fight, or I try to run, there's a good chance that bad
I
things
will become a consumer of ammunition. Exactly.
yeah, that's right. And, whereas if at no stage are you going to win that fight, and the police officer is going to go, oh, you know what, you really you won, you can go now. I mean, like, you're still going to go to jail. So let's just do that bit and then sort out if there's been a miscarriage of justice. Let's figure it out later, but don't get involved in a fight because it's not going to end
The
well.
guy is absolutely right, and it's one of these situations where it's it's recognizing that I've said this publicly and repeatedly, that as a society, I believe that we are overfed, over-entertained, undereducated, and absolutely self-obsessed.
Yes.
And I've had it. I've seen it in situations I've had in the past where I've worked in an enforcement capacity, and I've gone over to somebody and said, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind stopping? We're going to have to ask you to not do that or leave the premises." And I get, "You can't fucking talk to me. Who are you talking to? Do you know who I am?" And it's like, you know what? The answer is going to be four. It's going to be five knuckles. I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you exactly who you are, because there is a pecking order in the natural world, and
Yeah.
it's not how this works. But because you can't even raise your voice to people these days without kind of having some sort of safe space invoked upon you.
My favorite one, just before we get back to your research, my favorite example of that was I went to approach a rather intoxicated young man in a nightclub to tell him that he had to leave because he was rapidly about to get punched because he kept spilling drinks on people. And I was like, you need to call it a night. And he was arguing with me, and I said, look, you're going to have to go, or else I'm going to have to take you out. And he goes, you can't do that to me. I'm a real estate agent.
And everyone threw him out, right?
Legitimately, I paused for about 5 seconds because I was just trying to follow his train of thought as to why. I mean, I've heard I'm a law student. My dad's this, my uncle's a sergeant of arms. This, like, I've heard all those, but you can't touch me. I'm a real estate agent was a new one for me. And I had to
fabulous.
quickly check my legal knowledge and go, actually, I can. So.
And now I want to.
Fascinated to have this conversation outside, but
yeah. But everyone thinks that they're beyond. The world somehow owes them something. And if you, I mean, I read *Sapiens* last year, and I was disgusted by what we as a species actually are. And when I look around and I see the way people generally conduct themselves, and I wonder about the social contract, and I wonder about the future. But I think there is positivity, because you mentioned the younger generation, and I'll be honest, my generation were the people who are caning the drink and the drugs. Apparently, the younger generation don't smoke or drink. They are far more emotionally intelligent than I was at that age, I would suggest. Whether that equates to a more a kinder society, I don't know. I don't think the internet tells me that's the way it's going, but it's interesting the way that there are differences, in the same way that the Woodstock generation rebelled against their parents, and it's just interesting to see where socially this violence thing goes. We're seeing, certainly in the UK, I read something the other day, we're seeing a lot of alcohol-fueled violence in the between 50 and 60 years of age. And it's the generation who are a little bit older than me, who they were out there caning it, and they've done it for the rest of their lives. And so it's a generational behaviour as much as anything else. It'd be interesting to see where this goes. But sorry, back to the research.
we could do half a dozen shows on various tangents. We should probably try to finish one topic first.
Yeah, let's try that.
So back to the research. So what other findings came out that were of interest?
There is a disconnect between people who. Well, all right, we'll start at the top. There's no governance of violence. It's not recognised as an organisational risk. It's a health and safety risk or a security risk or a HR problem. And as a result, in organisations, the wrong people have responsibility for it. There is no framework, there is no structured framework that can be followed for how an organisation needs to prepare itself to become more productive and kinder, and kind of do because violence is actually, if you look at the corporate social responsibility kind of that model, that kind of concept, protecting your staff from violence fits right into it. You can go into an inner city area and plant a garden, or you can look after your fucking people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is more corporate social responsibility?
It's really interesting, actually, what you mentioned there about the wrong people having ownership of it. Certainly within the research that we've just completed here in Australia, we found that, and I know it was reflected in yours as well, depending on the organisation, I mean, the occupational violence or workplace violence can fall under your security manager, it can fall under HR manager, it can fall under health and safety, it can fall under maintenance. I've seen I forget the terminology.
That's a new one.
The operations manager who in theory has control over security as well, but really he's just booking contractors and gardeners. And somehow his portfolio includes workplace violence.
Well, this is a huge problem within the security industry. There are people, they look at it. You look at a problem of violence. It's man A hitting man B. Let's be sexist about this. Man A hitting man B. Oh, great. That's a security problem. That's a security problem. Yeah. Well, hold on. Is someone hurt? Well, that's a health and safety problem. Oh, wait, are they people? Well, that's a HR problem. And it's actually what is required is a steering committee.
Oh, wait, hang on a second. Someone filmed it. Now it's a PR problem.
Oh, perfect. Add those guys in.
A messaging problem. It's a communications problem. Now it's an executive problem because someone's got to get fired.
And then it's a legal problem. And then and you look at it and you think, well, hold on a minute. None of these people are either. Qualifications is a whole other area. There are no qualifications that are worth doing on this currently, but I'm fixing that for you.
Oh,
we'll talk about that later at the end, maybe when I get my plug out. But it's no one is prepared for it. No one understands it. Nobody has researched it. No one's experienced it. Nobody's lived it. And it's like, you're an expert in HR. Great, you're an expert in HR. Congratulations. You don't understand this problem. Talk to someone who does, and I don't mean a physical intervention expert. Talk to someone who's actually read the books, who's done the research, who is in touch with the academic literature, because the answer has been there for 40 years. And it's just a matter of kind of shaping the perspective of the organization. And we need to put a pound value on this or a dollar value on this. We need to be able to say to the organization, if you don't pay better attention to this problem, it's going to cost you X over the next 12 months.
Yeah. And I think for too long we've been so focused on the stick. We've been so focused on a compliance-driven motivation, and it is. I mean, look, it's still a valid form of motivation. It's a valid topic of conversation, especially now that organisations are recognising it as a problem, and they're putting it on their risk register, which means that they're now accountable for doing something about it, which is it's still forward progress. When I started talking about this 10 years ago, most organisations weren't even aware their staff being abused was a problem, but or at least it wasn't reflected on any documentation.
Well, no, because if we write it down, it means it happened.
That's right. I mean, it's like, we've had incident reports of people being abused, but it's not a risk. Well, how's it not a risk? Because no one's taken time off for it yet.
Exactly. Let's break it down. It hasn't cost us anything yet. And for me, when I talk about the risk of violence, I mean, I'll slip a little plug in here for you. I'm currently working one of the projects that I'm currently working on. I'm working on a formal risk assessment methodology for workplace violence. It doesn't exist. And I know it doesn't exist because it's fucking hard to do. It's taken me years. And I've got to a point where I'm feeling confident that I can start actually running tests through the model before I actually start talking about it publicly. But currently we're using a methodology, a health and safety methodology for risk assessment that is absolutely and utterly unfit for purpose.
I'd be really interested to explore that, because I've used some that were better than others, and we've put our minds to trying to create something ourselves. So I'd be very interested to compare notes on that.
Yeah, we could definitely do that.
So this problem of ownership.
Mm.
One of the things that we found in our research, and I'll probably do a future show about the research that we've just concluded. But one of the things that we found is that there are more individuals within organizations now that have good intentions and actually want to fix the problem, but they don't know where to start, and they may not have the budget to bring in or to hire one of the very, very few people that actually know what they're doing for a prolonged period of time. They might be able to get a workshop, they might be able to get some sort of program in, but realistically, we need to equip them to be able to manage this themselves. What do we do with those people? How do we help them solve this problem if we can't be there to hold their hand every step of the way?
I am. I've done this in the past, and it's something that I'm going to be launching. Again, it's one of the other projects that I'm working on. Is I am building a a violence risk management masterclass online course, and it will run the full gamut, the A to Z. Here is what good practice could look like, and here's how you do it, and here's some of the things, here's the pitfalls, and I'm putting together a program for it. And one of the other things that I'm offering to do is, I've done it in the past, is I will mentor. So I'm not going to come into your organization and do it. Well, I'm a consultant. I'm not. Consulting is you asking me and me telling you. If you want to hire me to do it for you, that's a whole other thing entirely.
Yeah, now I'm an in-house resource.
Absolutely, and I don't want to do that. It's not consulting. It's a case of I need to empower you to be able to do this so that I can leave.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Or else you can create some excellent documents in 6 months, and as soon as the money runs out, no one ever reads them again.
Absolutely. I've done this for a long time, both in the violent stuff and in information security and risk and security generally, and I've got a lot of different hats that I can wear. And it's usually the same thing. I will land. There will be some sort of initiative. Something bad will have happened. I will be part of a response. Someone will wheel out some money for me. I'll show up. Everyone will care about it until such a time as it stinks of effort. And then when the dust has settled, we'll all go back to looking out the window and pretending it didn't happen. And I would much rather kind of take passionate people who want to make things better, who recognize that change is necessary. And then over a period of time, I'm on the end of a phone, I'm on the end of an email. If they've got a problem, if they've got a challenge, if they want to know if this is a good idea or maybe that would work, I'll make myself available as a sounding board and we'll do it that way. And it's a hell of a lot cheaper than getting me in your office to write your policies.
Yeah, fully agree. Um, just moving back to the researchers before we, I guess, before we start heading towards a conclusion for this particular episode. What are the things that you found were, I guess, action points that came out of your findings? I mean, we realize there's a lot of things that are wrong, but what can we do to start fixing them?
The overwhelming theme that came out was that the biggest influence, both positive and negative, is management engagement.
Mm.
It's that both management and board level governance commitment, and commitment is more than lip service. Don't tell me you love me, show me you love me, do something. Don't put a poster on the wall saying we care about our staff, we will prosecute people who offend them, and then at the same time mistreat them yourself. A poster on the wall is just that. We need action. We actually need people to do something, and it's an active cultural change process. And you only really get those out of quantifying violence, putting a number on it, and then showing the business, here's what you could have won.
And you hit the nail on the head there from my perspective with a cultural change project. It's not about a policy or a procedure. It's about changing the culture of an organization, about what you will tolerate and what you won't tolerate, and having consistency across that.
Absolutely, and an organization will get what it tolerates.
Yep, it's not what you preach; it's what you tolerate.
Yeah, and it will get, and the culture will be formed around the worst behavior that the leadership are willing to tolerate. And I've said this many times on kind of cybersecurity conversations that I've had, and it fits this one as well. If you've got policy but you have no enforcement, you have no policy.
Yeah.
Because the answer will be yeah, and nothing ever gets done about it. It's never enforced. You've seen managers who have broken rules, who have been offensive or disrespectful or sexist or whatever. Nothing ever gets done about it. So where's the point? And then that will permeate through the organization, and then either people will withdraw entirely, withdraw labor, withdraw goodwill, or they'll just withdraw physically and go work somewhere else.
Yeah, it's well, one of the things that when I'm doing frontline training with otherwise nice people that are dealing with otherwise not nice people in their workplace is I say never repeat yourself when you say you're going to call the police. Don't start saying you need to leave or I'll call the police. If you don't do that, I'm going to call the police. If you don't stop, I'm going to call the police. No, I promise I'm really going to call the police this time. I mean, the threat's gone.
Exactly.
The threat is useless.
Yeah.
You didn't do it the first time. So now they're just more emboldened because they know you're not going to call the police.
Well, this is it. Never make a threat you're not willing to carry out.
Exactly.
Many years ago, I was involved in a fairly robust conversation with a gentleman in a kebab shop, and he reached over he reached over the counter and he picked up the kebab knife, and then he told me he was going to cut off my head.
Right.
And I put my hands behind my back. I leant over, gave him my neck, and said, "Whatever you do, don't miss." And then he's standing there holding this knife and kind of wishing it was anything other than a knife, because now he's got to put it down.
Yeah. My kids call my bluff on that all the time. Like, if you don't do that, I'm going to take away the iPads. Yeah, no, you won't, because that iPad gives you peace and quiet.
Absolutely.
So other than that, so we've got good management. So good engaged management and consistency in behaviours. What else do you see as being the steps towards good practice?
Well, that's the silver bullet.
That's it.
Out of everything I saw, there were people who talked about making the using environmental design to make sure that if you start pulling from things like defensible space theory. Mm-hmm. You start looking at the built environment and creating an environment that actively dissuades negative behaviors. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. If I'm engaged in either functional or predatory violence, that isn't going to work.
Yes.
It may work in other areas, but again, it's that one extinguisher for all problems. I think everything works a little bit, and even training. There is an argument as far as training is concerned, because if we're now talking about mitigations, that if I bring my staff in and I say, okay, I'm going to teach you conflict management, and I'm going to teach you customer service skills, and I'm going to teach you there's an element here of us putting the blame on them, saying that when this stuff happens, it's their fault. And that,
sometimes it is.
Sometimes it is, and I'll hold my hands up as somebody who works in a shop, and sometimes there are some days I would go looking for it.
You couldn't pay me enough to go back to a customer service role.
No. Well, tragically, we're all still in one, just more expensive customers.
Yeah, but you get to choose when you reply to the emails.
Yeah. But again, there is an element of there needs to be a level of personal resilience. We can't have snowflakes in the workplace. There has to be there is an element of cut and thrust in dealing with other people. And the more I try not to offend people, the more I do it accidentally. And there are people who are current in our society who are looking to be offended, and so I don't even care about those folks. I'll just go for it. But we need people, and again, back to stoicism in some respects, people need to be more resilient, so that we can put them in a workplace. There will be people who are disrespectful to each other, and it might just be the heat of the moment. I've snapped at people that I've worked with. I snap at my wife when I'm in the middle of something and something else comes up, and it's not. There's no intent. It's just a response to current conditions, and that's not something that we should all go running to HR for and invoking the violence policy. But at the same time, where it becomes a norm, where it becomes a structured set of behaviors that are becoming repeated, then something needs to be done about it.
I'll tell you, actually, when I was working for a state health department, I got seconded away from my preferred position being in the training area, and I was receiving reports of violence and in the office, and we weren't supposed to get HR complaints. It was mostly supposed to be patient initiated or public initiated aggression that would come to us. But occasionally we'd get the HR ones if there was a bullying or harassment complaint, just end up in our desk. And I was marveling at the fact that most, like probably 85 to 90% of the complaints I was getting were coming from one, like a handful of wards, and they're all surgical. And nearly always the complaint was being made by a nurse about a surgeon. And as a,
Well, they are mostly psychopaths.
well, there's nothing about that.
There's research that's been done.
But when you look at this, the situation, as you said, in response to circumstances, I mean, they're working long hours. They're literally right on top of each other. I mean, the surgeon is relying on his assistants to be right where he needs them, when he needs them, and they're all fatigued and cramping and sweating, and and the consequences of doing something wrong can literally be life and death. And we might have thought this would be a 2-hour procedure, and now we're in hour 14. There's so many different stresses that are probably going to lead to people not being completely polite to each other if something goes wrong.
Absolutely. There's been situations where, and it still happens to this day, despite all the work I do on myself, sometimes I'm not my best self.
Yeah. Look, sometimes just in this research on high performers, I mean, if you've got someone in your workplace who thinks they're God's gift and they're the best at everything they do and no one else can even touch them, normally that person is an absolute dick and you don't want to be around them. But if someone's going to be performing open heart surgery on me, I want that guy to believe he is God's gift and no one can touch him.
It's interesting that. Yeah, absolutely. I want the best guy, and this isn't a personality contest.
Yeah, I don't care if he's a dick. If he's the best surgeon around, I want him.
It's like, if people are shooting at you, you're not going to choose your bodyguard on who has a nice manner.
That's right.
It's frustrating, and it's one of those things that the more accomplished people get, the more confident they get, and the more confident they get, the more they're called arrogant by people who have no accomplishment. That sounds harsh and arrogant.
Was that a self-diagnosis just then? Or?
It could have been. Could have been. Yeah. It's like, the thing is, my credentials speak for themselves, and yet I'll still get people who he thinks a bit of himself. No, I've got some paperwork here. I think I'm a deeply flawed human being, but I know a bit about this subject.
Yeah. So you mentioned you're working on a few things. Let's talk a little bit about what you're doing and what you've got coming up.
Okay, I am, and I juggle between them because my passion, like I say, deeply flawed human being, my passion waxes and wanes. I'll get involved in, I spent a couple of weeks really putting my head into my violence risk management, violence risk assessment model, which is coming on really nicely. I think it's going to be, I'd like to think it's going to be something special and useful. I'll spend some time on that, and then I'll hit a wall with it and think, I'm not quite sure that makes any sense. So I'll go back to the things I was reading that inspired me, and then I'll start working on my violence risk management course. And then I'll spend some time on that, and then suddenly I'll have a brainwave and go back to the risk assessment. So these things are happening in a kind of a leapfrog sort of way. Hopefully by the end of the year, depending on when I'm next allowed out, we will. I'll have both. I'll have both of them in the market. But
is that for the pandemic or just the house arrest?
It's just a house arrest. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. You're talking to a guy who's writing 3 books on 3 different subjects. That yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've got a book as well. Yeah, there is that. Thank you.
Well, plug the book. Come on.
I'm at early stages. I'm turning my doctoral thesis into a. Sorry, my computer's talking to me. I'm talking to a publisher about turning my thesis into a kind of short book on the subject. So there is that too, but it's still early to kind of publicly talk about who it is and where it will be. So
excellent. All right. So you've got a podcast or a YouTube channel as well?
I've got a YouTube channel. I'm not doing as much on that as I like. I'm gonna be. People have laughed at this. I'm gonna be launching a series called Why Your Security Sucks. And each episode will be a different reason of why your security sucks, and it'll be done in a kind of helpful, friendly sort of way without giving you free consultancy. And I'm currently writing the scripts for that, and that'll be probably the next big flurry of activity people will see from me.
Perfect. All right, Rich, this has been a lot of fun. I said to you when we did the Brazilians podcast that we needed to do one with the gloves off, and I knew it would be a laugh. So I'm glad we've had a chance to do it, and there's plenty of meat still on the bone for a follow-up show. So hopefully we get to do it again very soon.
That'd be very cool.
In the meantime, people want to know more about you, or they want to engage your services. Where do they go?
They can find me on LinkedIn, or they can find me at the securitydoctor.expert.
Oh, securitydoctor.expert. He's a doctor and an expert.
Yeah, I don't think I am an expert. I've regretted buying that domain, but the .com wasn't available, so yeah.
That's right. You can run with it. You can have some fun with it.
Yeah.
All right, Rich, thanks very much for your time, mate. We'll jump on over to Patreon for the bonus questions. If you want to hear Rich answer the Magnificent 7 bonus questions, make sure you subscribe at www.patreon.com/managing violence. If you're leaving us here, thank you once again, Dr. Rich Diston.
Thanks very much. Take care.
How much fun was that? I hope you guys enjoyed listening to that half as much as I enjoyed doing it. Dr. Diston is a great character and also obviously very knowledgeable, very learned in his field, and it's great to talk to him. That's it for this week. Next week, we have another PhD, Dr. Nate Meehan from Second Sight, talking about threat assessment. Very interesting conversation. Look forward to that one. In the meantime, make sure you check us out on social media. We are on pretty much all the major platforms: LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. We're everywhere. Go give us a like, give us a follow, share our stuff, and make sure you head over to patreon.com/managing violence and contribute if you'd like to get bonus content. Until next time, I'll talk to you soon.